This is Duke University.
I did want to start by giving a little bit of background and first of course, thank the organizer for the workshop, but the other papers have been extremely stimulating and I can already see many interconnections. So we turn now to the Mekong, which is Southeast Asia's longest drainage system. It also originates in Qinghai province near the Tibetan border, and it wends its way southward through Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam to empty its 9 mouths into the South China Sea. It's a lot smaller than the Huanghe, but 60 million people or more get their lives from the Mekong River. They farm, they fish, they have other riverine livelihoods, some of which you've also seen on the Brahmaputra so far. And the lower Mekong, where we'll go in a few moments, is still a veritable kind of rice bowl, and it's a biodiversity hotspot. It's gotten a lot of attention for reasons that have to do first with China building 6 hydroelectric dams up in Yunnan province, which are going to ultimately affect the flow down in the Delta. But I also want to point out several places in history where this region was very important and talk about how people specifically dealt with that. So here we are at the Mekong, just to give you a comparison. I think we've already seen a picture that looks a little bit like this. And there's the Brahmaputra that's being highlighted in part of the Yellow River. Of course, if you compare the Mekong to the other watersheds, it looks very small, I know that. But it's still very important. And what makes it so important really is that the 6 riparian countries it goes through are still considered developing nations. So just as we've just heard about how the Brahmaputra is being used less in traditional ways.
I'm sorry, what is the percentage?
This has to do with I think it also has to do with a watershed or alluvium. Yeah, they're watersheds. So a difference in the Mekong, at least with the Brahmaputra now, is that many people, millions of people, 67 million, 70 million people, live along the Mekong and they still fish and they still engage in agriculture. And the shifts that we have seen so far are shifts that still involve very traditional kinds of uses of the river. I have to show you Angkor Wat because I was invited and I'm an archaeologist and everyone wants to see a temple. I get criticized if I don't show a temple. So there's your temple, right? But the reason I show it, and this is a National Geographic picture, is partly because I want you to look at these fellows in the front here. We'll come back to them at the end. When I'd like to make the argument that there are some lessons to be learned from some of the best practices of working with the rivers, not that all were best, and that they do come back in many ways, not just to the local level, but also to the role of ideology and community. So my study has these several parts. I'm not going to use my paper. I'll be talking about the anatomy of the Mekong, so you get a sense of what it looks like because it's quite varied from its northernmost origin source all the way down to the Delta. I'll then talk about the Mekong as a biophysical region and divide it up for you, and I'll talk about some of the post-20th century developments. Since I am an archaeologist, and I apologize to people who are from or work in Thailand here, I'm going to use 2 Cambodian views of the Delta, of the Mekong. One is the Mekong Delta, where I ran archaeological projects for 15 years before shifting up to the Angkor area, where I've worked since 2010. I haven't lost my love for the Delta. So I'm going to use these 2 places to try to understand the Mekong. And I'll look at turning points, hinge points, what archaeologists like to call revolutions. We have an agricultural revolution, we have an urban revolution. So for us, the idea of hinge points is very important. But I want to emphasize that from an archaeological point of view, when you look over 3,000 years, we see cycles of collapse and regeneration. But we also see some hinge points where irreversible change happens. And I think it's those different, the contrast there between what is cyclical and what is irreversible that we need to concentrate on. And I don't know if there are lessons from the past, but I'll talk about that at the end. So let's start up at the headwaters on the Tibetan Plateau. Here, there's quite a bit of discussion, if you're a scientist, about specifically where the Mekong starts. But the current wisdom says that you can go to this glacier at Mount Guosangmucha. Forgive all my mispronunciations here. This is a glacier complex. That's it. And that's the place right there. And here's the Mekong dripping down. And here it is, according to the Japanese scientists who were there a few years back. And that's the Lhasa Gongma glacial stream. So it goes then down into the Chinese version of the Mekong. And I'm going to mispronounce this. How do you say Lanjiangjiang? Lanjiangjiang. And it goes down into the Lansangjiang, part of the river on the Sichuan-Tibet border. But it has quite a distance to go, 4,300 kilometers here. So here we are up in Qinghai, and here we are down in Vietnam. And it looks quite different as you move. So up here in the northernmost part of what I'm calling the Mekong, which has two names there, both in Tibet and in China, you see that it has certain characteristics that make it an interesting and important river, but it looks quite different from the delta at the end. When you get into the Thai-Lao area, which is where we get the name Mae Nam Kong from, it's, as I understand it, but I may be corrected by two audience members, that the term Mekong derives from a contracted form of Thai and Lao Mae Nam Kong, which means mother of water. Is that right? Sorry? Yeah. Ah, right. But the name shifts as we keep moving south. So as we go through this area, the Mekong flanks this Thai-Lao border for about 600 kilometers, and it's a broad river. There are some major tributaries, and they're very important in northeast Thailand, the Chi and the Mun. Archaeologically, we know that as well. But then the Mekong drops down into Cambodia after southern Laos, and it hits a series of rapids that makes it very difficult to navigate. We'll return to that. And then as it goes a little bit further, it spreads into this kind of floodplain, which is what we think of as the Mekong in what will be the lower basin. It's not maybe as meandering as the Yellow River across all of Hebei, but it's a very broad fan that we'll get to, perhaps 795,000 kilometers squared. So that's where we're headed. And the Vietnamese, interestingly enough, do use the term Kulong or Nine Mouths to talk about this area down here where the Mekong comes out to the South China Sea. So there are different divisions of the Mekong River Basin, and I want to talk about it as a biophysical region and apologize in advance for setting aside the upper basin, which would be China and Burma, only for my discussion because I'm not a specialist in that area. And then the middle region, which is very key, also is not my specialty, which would be primarily Laos and Thailand. But if you have questions, you can direct them over there to that part of the audience. But I'm going to talk more about what's called the lower Mekong Basin. And it's still quite big here. And you can see that it supports around, sorry, I'll skip the figures here. The lower Mekong Basin has has three parts of it, really. There's the Mekong River here in Cambodia, the Tonle Sap, which I'll talk to, and the Mekong Delta. So I'll be talking about those three areas. Forgive me for using such a technical map, but this is the Mekong Delta, and it's where I worked for a very long time, so I love it. And very few other people I know who are archaeologists do. This is where I work. Higher Mekong Basin here. And you can see that much, but not all of the Mekong deltas in Vietnam. So we know quite a bit about its natural history. There have been many efforts to try to figure out when it first established itself as a delta around 9,000 years ago. It's changed in its character, but for the last 3,000 years, this area up here has been quite stable, and that's probably why we have archaeological evidence for these very large settlements that started about 2,500 years ago. All right, this is what it looks like in Landsat, and I have the triangle because deltas are supposed to be triangular. So I thought I would put that on for you. But what's really clear is how green it is, and that's because it's a very rich place and it's pretty wet. These pictures will start to look familiar to you because it almost seems like you could take pictures straight out of the Brahmaputra that we just saw and put them right over here in the delta. But it's very much a riverine landscape. The changes that have happened with canalization in the 19th century have affected the vegetation. We'll get there. But some of the changes have been shifts that are still shifts to riverine adaptations. For example, in southern Vietnam, as the area here has become much more saline with the intrusion of saltwater, people have shifted to shrimp fisheries and other kinds of fisheries. So still using it. It's not like we have big factories that have come in to that area. And it's interesting to point out that while the Mekong Delta seems very important to us today, and maybe there's 17 million or 17 million people who live there is one figure, as of the beginning of the 1900s, and definitely in the 19th century before that, it was referred to as a water frontier. It was kind of a Wild West. It was a water zomia, to use zomia again. And people found that they felt it was dangerous and kind of scary to live down there. However, it was also a multi-ethnic area. So there were ports that you see all along here, and they had Chinese and Khmer and Thai and Lao, all kinds of people who were living there and intermarrying. So it's a very interesting kind of place to live. Here are some pictures, some of which we've taken from our field surveys to show that the Delta can be very wet and it can be very dry. And that's the key, really, to the whole Mekong, lower Mekong Basin watershed, is that you have this monsoon kind of annual cycle, which in the best of times means that you've got about 8 months of wet and you've got about 4 months of dry, but we'll get to that. It's particularly important when you move up from this area, which is Mekong Delta, and one part of the lower Mekong, into this area, and this is all the Tonle Sap Basin. So the two basins just sort of melt into each other, which is why I'm using them for this particular presentation. And the Tonle Sap is, of course, where Angkor developed up there. But the reason is because this is one of the most amazing inland water bodies. At least it is in Southeast Asia. I can't speak for China or Japan or Korea. Partly because it quintuples in size every year. Quintuples. And it quintuples in size because by about October, you have so much silt coming down here, very small compared to Huanghe. I checked the figures, but it's a lot for the Mekong. You have so much silt coming down, and the Tonle Sap is actually the riverbed is lower, that what happens is it backs up, and the water starts going back up. Instead of traveling south, as it's supposed to, it backs up, and it goes into this area. And all of this area gets flooded. So it's a phenomenally rich area. It's called a flood pulsed ecosystem. And we have it really for about 8 months a year. This 4-month flow reversal accounts for about 70% of the Tonle Sap Lake's volume. Not only does it get 5 times bigger, but the water levels can get 7 to 8 meters deeper. So it's huge. It's a very important kind of... It used to be fringed by mangroves, partly, and there's flooded forest, but not all of it. The mangroves were down here throughout actually down there in Vietnam. So let's go up the Tonle Sap River. Here you can see what the Tonle Sap Lake looks like in a typical dry season, still very big and important. And here you can see what happens as you're cruising up. And fish is extremely important, and I'll get back to fish. For the sake of time, let me just show you how the Tonle Sap pulses, and then we'll get to the archaeology. So in a typical year, and this is another Landsat, there's the Tonle Sap, and here's the Mekong. Well, this is what it looks like. Here's the Mekong, and you can barely see, but there's the Tonle Sap River going up, and these are the mouths going into Vietnam. So this is in June, but it rains. So in a typical year, for sure by June, you've got monsoon rains. They start every day at 3 p.m. I assure you, because we go out and survey until 3 p.m. every day. And then in a typical year, you get major flooding. So where I worked in the Delta, about 50% of the area is underwater. 2011 was a really bad year for everyone. It was too much flooding. We have climatic instability with global warming, or who knows who caused it, but whoever caused the global warming, it's a bad thing, and it's happening. So this is what it should look like here around June, and this is what happened. So central Thailand was flooded out, and you can see it's too much water here. But this process should happen every year. Now, there are these turning points in local practices I will briefly talk about today, and these are a really big issue. We know already that there are mistakes being made, and we already can see the pressure. So there are models. There's many people working on this kind of issue, but basically the reason I use this particular graphic is just to indicate to you that climate change and whether it's human caused or not, and definitely human intervention through hydropower projects, are having a huge impact. And we're seeing that already, not only in the Tonle Sap, but as you can see, I added the Mekong Delta. The models that assume the worst case scenario of a 2-degree temperature increase by 2050 look grim, so that not only do we have an increase in droughts by 2050, with some areas of the basin that are highly affected, So here you can see that especially areas that are in the Korat Plateau, the Chien Mun, would be in a really bad shape. And in fact, I don't know if it would be farmable up there. Then how about floods? Let's look down south. Too much water is not a good thing anymore. And so if you have this level of flooding and it's predictable, people have high agricultural productivity. If you have this much flooding, then what you have is destroyed crops. And so USAID and many other organizations are talking about these pockets of vulnerability, which you can see. And what's interesting to me is that if you go back, sorry to make you cross-eyed, the areas that would be affected by drought are different from the areas that will be affected by floods. And these are both processes that will happen. And yet there are other factors. And there are other places in the lower Mekong that will be affected by this sort of aggregate between the precipitation, the temperature, the flooding, the drought, the sea level rise, and the salinity. So this is all to make a case that the Mekong Basin, especially the lower Mekong, has a lot to lose. Right? And dams, of course, are a big deal. So I just give you very brief background here to say that since the 50s, there's been a big interest in damming the Mekong, although it's only really happened in full force in the last 12 years or so. But during the Indochina conflicts, we had the Pamong Dam proposed and 2 other major dams. These are in Cambodia. And then 4 minor dams for all of the Mekong Basin participants in this Mekong scheme. And the idea was to control floodwater and to enhance livelihoods and produce more food and electricity and to win hearts and minds. Well, it didn't work. And of course, the whole area descended into chaos. But I want to point this out because the ideas came directly from working with the Bureau of Reclamation in the United States and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So maybe not the most appropriate technology. And yet, today, well, this is 6 months ago, but as of almost today, you see that there are dams. After things calmed down in the region in the 90s, plans resumed with a Mekong sub-region organization that developed. And you can see up here, of course, in Yunnan province, you have a number of dams, but they're coming in Laos, PDR, and then they're also coming on board here in Thailand. And of course, even here, there are plans. In fact, some of them have been built. There's one, I think, Sesan 2 maybe has been finished since this graphic was made. So climate change, dams, Tonle Sap, Mekong, all of this affects everyone, and it comes down to the level of individuals and what they eat. We can see it already in the Mekong Delta. Here are some news reports I pulled off from 2015. And in case you want to know where it is, this is one area that I think was a hotspot that was identified in a previous map. Here's a farmer, and he's lost his rice because of drought. And here's a farmer, and he's lost his sugarcane fields, and that's because of the increase in saltwater intrusion. So the processes are already happening, and it's not supposed to look that dry, right? So you have the increased frequency of droughts, you have lower water levels, you have less fish, coastal erosion, and some people argue you're starting to see an increase in migration out of Vietnam's Mekong Delta to cities because people can't live there anymore, and it's not 2050. So that's my point. There's a lot to lose. Now, of course, I want to go to the archaeology and talk about turning points. So, sorry, I'll just subject you to a few chronologies. I am an archaeologist. I have to do this. I'm not really going to talk about this period of prehistory because of the flooding regime of the lower Mekong, which covers deposits, again, not as much as the Yellow River, where archaeological deposits can be 10 meters below the surface, but still it's pretty hard to find. We have a much stronger record for what we call protohistory, Iron Age, and so on, and definitely for the historical period, which is the pre-Angkorian and Angkorian period. So I'll show you just a few pictures of some of my colleagues running projects. This would be in Kampong Cham, which is still part of the Mekong Delta. No, it's part of the Tonle Sap Basin by the time you get up there. So I'll talk a little bit, very, very briefly, about the Iron Age, because I have till 12:15. Okay, because it's a period I worked on, and also because it's the period where the Mekong Delta is the most important archaeologically. So when I say important, I don't know if you like gold. They liked it in the Brahmaputra, and they liked it in the Mekong Delta, and this is some of the gold that was excavated off of a site, not that I worked on at Prohia, but in the Delta at Preveng province. The work that they did was primarily on a cemetery, And then we ended up working for a long time at the site of Angkor Barai, which is an ancient urban site. But the whole, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, but this whole delta area seems to have changed in the first 5 centuries of the first millennium CE, right? So we have possibly as old as 5th century wooden Buddhas. We have statuary you'll see in a moment. We have these big urban centers coming in. We have Chinese accounts of visiting the kingdom of Funan. We have institutionalized religion. So everything is changing. This is before Angkor, and I think that's very important. So this is just one of those Google pictures of the site I worked on. This is Angkor Barai, 300 hectares. The biggest at the time, possibly Akayo, down here in the Delta, was bigger, although when you look at where they were settled, it's not. But there were connecting kinds of canals. We've dug them, we've dated them, we've worked on the city, and what we can say is that these canals were not for agriculture. They were to further connect people. So people were connected through rivers and they were connected through canals. And that's very important because the entire Mekong Delta was linked together so that they could trade in the Gulf of Thailand and the whole South China Sea network with China and all the way to the Mediterranean. Okay, sorry, that's the fastest I've ever moved through the really historic period. But I need to go to the pre-Angkorian and Angkorian period quickly so that we can get to people managing the rivers. Sorry, because we do see that people were farming in the floodplains during that period, but we don't see any evidence that people are trying to modify rivers, right? And they're not engaged in big irrigation that would affect the water table. In the same way, we get to the pre-Angkorian period and we see sites also in the Delta, even my site was occupied then. But the biggest site was Sambor Praekuk, and we see more urban centers with a very strong religious and definitely Indic look to them. So I have some of the kind of imagery that you could see, the kinds of architecture also pops up on sites like Angkor Barai, where you have these brick structures, these temples and shrines that would have housed images, primarily Vaishnavite and Shaivite, but there are others. And all of this is happening again at the edges of the watershed. And I think that's very important because either you have people flat out in the Delta, but they're not cutting canals, or you have people who are living at the edge of this and they're still working with the river rather than against it. And you see that the primary areas of settlement during this pre-Angkorian period would be down here. So there's Angkor Barai and Akayo. Then you have Sambor Praekuk here, but this whole area, which is around the fringes of the watershed to take advantage of floating rice agriculture and recession rice agriculture and pretty non-intensive forms of agriculture that did not require landscape sort of reconstruction. You also see that there are temples that were built along the Mekong in the areas close to rapids that would have been unsafe to travel. And we see goods moving around. But the reason why people think about Cambodia, if they think of Cambodian archaeology, is of course for the Angkorian period. And I showed you Angkor Wat. You don't have to see a temple again. As an archaeologist, I want to show you what really matters is not the temples, but how those temples played roles as kind of magnets and anchors for broader systems. So this is a map out of Tegan Hall's recent dissertation. Angkor is here, but what we're finding by looking at inscriptions, by getting radiometric dates, and also by charting out roads and figuring out how old these formalized roads are, is that Angkor was part of a network. This is not the whole network. Actually, in the 11th century, there were connections out to Western Thailand. And it's this kind of connectivity that really matters. Goods would have moved in and out. People would have come to this area for fish. They would have come out there for salt. There were goods being traded. There was a tremendous amount of iron production in this area here. And we're just starting to put that together. That being said, the other point to make is that Angkor as a polity remained largely rural. This is what you can see today and archaeologically what you can see, which is a kind of very low density settlement that was based on rural agrarian practices, just so that you see what this floating rice looks like. It just looks like another rice field, but people do it today. And this is the kind of thing people also would have done at the beginning of the Angkorian period.
I'm sorry, what is floating rice?
Floating rice is done in depressions that fill with water during the maximum floods. And as the floods recede, the water stays in the depressions. And the floating rice sometimes has roots sometimes up to 3 meters deep, although on average it's 1.2 meters deep for the root systems. It is a kind of wet rice. So in Cambodia, you have wet rice, which is flood recession, where they plant where there's water from the floods. Then today you have floating rice, which is a very small, but it's an important part of the agricultural system. And now there's canal-based irrigation in some areas. And there's also rain-fed. It's wet, but it's not very wet. So there's multiple kinds of, I mean, as an example, Khmer farmers, even in the 1950s, routinely had several dozen kinds of rice varieties that they would be planting on these sort of micro topographic differently fields to take advantage of the water. And and by the way, this picture here, this was only from about 10 years ago. So there is a lot of mechanization coming in, but it's not practicable for a lot of people in developing countries like Cambodia. Okay, but where you really want to go is Angkor. So here we are. You can go to the Angkor Park with me. There's the Tonle Sap. Here's the core of the Angkor Archaeological Park. We call this Greater Angkor. I want you to see these hills. They're important, and we'll get back to them later. But what you can see is 1,000 square kilometers. And the reason there's all of these dots is because there are, our teams have recorded almost 1,400 temples, large temples and shrines in that area. And by the way, it's an arbitrary cutoff that had to do with UNESCO, a World Heritage nomination. So there's more. I showed you, there's a temple again. You want Angkor? There's Angkor. There it is. And it's important because Angkor was the biggest pre-colonial, pre-modern state in Southeast Asia. There were probably several pulses of imperialism. It wasn't consistent as far as we can tell, but there was this broad political reach because of the agrarian foundation. And that agrarian foundation was based on and dependent on the Mekong and this flood pulse. I have a picture here of Taret, partly because he has a very interesting and checkered history. He's in Angkor Wat too, right? He lives over here. But I have him because Khmers today consider him to be the founding god of Cambodia. He's not the god, that's just a statue, but the spirit lives inside him, right? Okay, so urban settlement. In the core area, we've done lots of work with several PhD students who have invested thousands of hours and many years. And from there, what we can see is that through this area we call Greater Angkor, the 1,000 square kilometer area, there are hotspots of settlement, which you can see by little temples and shrines, not just by the state temples. You can also see that around the hotspots, people have farms, they have fields, so that even in the core of Angkor, even amidst these 1,400 shrines and temples, you have a lot of farming going on. It's an agro-urban city. This is what National Geographic thinks it looked like, and even when National Geo reconstructs it, you can see all the green, right? So there are these big reservoirs. There's a lot of water there. And Angkor has been called a hydraulic city, partly because of all of the water management. I will talk only briefly about this and tip my hat to Roland Fletcher and his team through the Greater Angkor Project, Terry Lustig, a lot of people, Mati Kumu have worked on this. They've reconstructed what the water management structure looks like. The reason why this was necessary is because of rivers coming down and the Tonle Sap quintupling in size. Those are good things if you're a rice farmer, but they're bad things if you want to have a city that's dry and full of temples. And so there was this 5 or 6 century long process of trying to keep the center from flooding. And that's hard. It's very hard. So on the one hand, you have kings coming in and they're building these giant above ground reservoirs, which everyone loves to look at. We'll see a picture. But on the other hand, they've got people trying just to do workarounds so that the city doesn't flood. And the workarounds get progressively more complicated to the point where they actually start rerouting a river and maybe creating a river just to keep Angkor dry. This is what the water management system looked like by the end of the Angkorian period. There are rivers. We'll come back up here to the Phnom Kulen Mountains. But you can see this river. It gets routed over there. There's also a Polk River, but the Polk River and other rivers get shunted out as well, right? And some rivers like the Siem Reap may have flat out been created by the Khmers.
So is it mainly tanks and canals?
Mainly tanks and canals, but with accompanying huge embankments. Yeah, lots. Sorry, those are coupled. At the local level, you have little ponds, household ponds, which the Chinese describe and which we've mapped that go back at least 1,500 years. But these are mostly canals. I mean, we call them channels, I guess, and they're diversion channels. There's a small area that could have been irrigated. Even Bernard Philippe Grolier said it was a pretty small area and it would have been a buffer. But most of the water management was to keep Angkor dry. And that worked for quite a long time, except that the system continued to get more convoluted. and the weather changed. So we go from this lovely medieval warm period where it's great to grow rice and it's nice and wet to the beginning of the Little Ice Age, which spelled droughts and dryness for most of mainland Southeast Asia. And you can see here, this is a precipitation map, and it goes up and down always because that's how climate is. But where you see the red dots, you can see protracted droughts. And so we have droughts, but we also know from tree ring records that we also have 6 of the 20 heaviest rainfall years during the same time period. So the engineers have to go left, and then they have to go right, and they have to figure out how to deal with the flood, and then there's no water for the fields. And so it's a very difficult time. And by probably before 1431, when the Thais sacked Angkor, we had the movement of all the elite, political elite, south to new capitals.
I'm sorry. Can you talk about the Little Ice Age and the relationship to this volatile climate?
Yeah.
So what is the date of the Little Ice Age? Everybody has different dates for the Little Ice Age.
I think there's a lot of consensus. So the medieval warm period usually goes from around 900 to about 1200. And that's around the world, but it has different impacts depending on where you are.
That's the warm age.
Which is a good time. And you do see a fluorescence archaeologically in a lot of parts of the world, right? But then the problem is the Little Ice Age, which is also a time where in several parts of the world, in very arid regions, you have the abandonment of areas because there's not enough water for farming. And that's what we also see here in some tropical regions.
So that would be from 1400 to about 1600.
Around 1300 to about 1600, yeah. I mean, some people say 1690.
And where was that on the bottom chart?
Where is that on the bottom chart? So the medieval warm period would be, well, sorry, this is based on Brendan Buckley's tree ring data from northern Vietnam. So he needed trees. So it's partial because he had to have trees that dated that old, right? So his oldest trees go to here, and then he's got them through there. So the medieval warm period is generally from here to about there. And then everything takes a dive, and you see that you don't have as much rain, you have a lot of unpredictability starting. I have no idea, and I'm sure people are discussing to what extent the Little Ice Age could have been anthropogenic, although because we actually have evidence of sedimentation in the Mekong Delta going back 1,000 years that could suggest human impact. I mean, there are suggestions of it, but I don't know that anyone has suggested the entire Little Ice Age was caused by human impact. Right? Okay, so Angkor collapses, although actually most of the rural population stays, and that's what we're working on in my project. This phase of the project is actually starting in May, if we get permissions. But people continued. The Khmers were around, and they headed south along the Mekong, actually, and first along the Mekong, and then periodically in the Tonle Sap Basin, but primarily down the Tonle Sap down into the Mekong area. So this is a Dutch map of the next major capital of Longvec, where my colleague Martin Polkinghorn is working now. It was a major capital. And finally, they went, of course, to Phnom Penh, which is also known as the Quatre Bras, the 4 arms, because there are 4 pieces of river that come in there. So the Mekong has always been fundamental there. And in fact, the Mekong, it hasn't just been fundamental to Khmers, of course, and where they settle. But when the French came in, and they were, of course, competing with the British to find access to China, they did these major expeditions. This one was particularly infamous, which was the French Mekong expedition of 1866 to 1868, because of Dudard de la Grey and Francis Garnier, both who died, one during it actually, and then he came to a rather bloody end near Shanghai later. But anyway, the reason it's so important is primarily because of Louis Delaporte and the illustrations he made, which showed the French could only go so far up the Mekong as a trade route. The Mekong Delta, like I said, was a kind of no man's land or a watery zomia. Here's a nice map of the 19th century, and this is what it looked like, right? Amongst, I don't know why it says amongst the Shans, because the Shans are not in the Delta. But anyway.
Everybody's called a Shan.
Everyone's a Shan, yeah. Independence, I want to take you quickly to the 20th century. I'll be done in 5 minutes, I promise. A very good time in some ways for Indo-Chinese countries because they all declared independence. Of course, Ho Chi Minh first, but Lao independence and then Cambodian independence followed. But of course, the Europeans didn't believe in independence. So we have the first Indochina War, which followed all the independence. And then the second Indochina War, which in the United States, people call the Vietnam War. But if you ask the Vietnamese and Cambodians, they call it the American War. And if I'm lucky, they'll blame the French. And then after that, we have this third Indochina War, right? And that has gone on with the Khmer Rouge regime, the Hmong insurgency, the Cambodian Vietnamese War after Pol Pot slaughtered Vietnamese, which prompted the Sino-Vietnamese. It was really messy for a long time. Anyway, I won't talk about causality there, except to say Henry Kissinger, I disagree with him. Right, so anyway, but what's important, and here's why. What's important is, of course, we did have this bombing campaign. It wasn't just Cambodia. I know it was very much in Vietnam and terrible in Laos. Let's get that straight. It's all over, and here's a pattern of bombing. But I do want you to see that the Mekong Delta got hammered by it. 2.76 million tons of ordnance. All of this is part of the lower Mekong. And you can see what it looked like. Here's some of the bombs going on. In fact, there was one concentrated period of bombing of about a year, and it was called Operation Menu. And during that time, that was bombing of Cambodia. They had Operation Breakfast, Operation Lunch. Let's see, Operation Breakfast, Lunch, Supper, Dinner. Sorry, Supper, Snack, Dessert, Dinner, and Dessert. Sorry. And so it was huge amounts of bombing. Of course, it destabilized the region. But what I'm saying here is that it affected the lower Mekong's hydrology. So did the herbicides that were used during the Second Indochina War. There were 20,000 sorties over South Vietnam alone. And here's another one of those maps. See where it's red? Red is Agent Orange. But that was only part of what we dumped. We also dumped other herbicides. Here's what the mangroves look like in Vietnam's Mekong Delta before Agent Orange and the herbicides. And this is what it looked like later. Not only were there obviously birth defects, not only do you have problems, environmental problems generally, in some areas, like in the Khmer Peninsula, they've lost, I have to get the figure, something like 40% or 50% of their forest, 75% decline in forest area between 1968 and 2003. So it started because of the bombing and because of the herbicides. But it continues, right? The groundwater is contaminated. It's terrible, right? So if you look at the Mekong Basin generally, you can see by looking at the hydroclimate that every aspect gets affected by human decision-making. From the glaciers and our global warming to the monsoon systems, to the groundwater, which is getting soaked up now, and even to the coastal and tidal processes. So managing the Mekong. We see climate change all over. This is a picture that you're probably familiar with, looking at the relative vulnerability of coastal deltas. I wanted to point out that there's high vulnerability in several that we're discussing today, including the Ganges-Brahmaputra. And there's certainly a role for international meetings and delegations and commissions. And so here are some, and they're important. There's ASEAN, which doesn't include China, by the way, but the Mekong River Commission here, and they're doing lots of good work and important work. I would point out that China has not been a major player directly, although Cambodia's prime minister is trying very hard to represent China and what he does. And this is a problem because you have the upper and you have the lower impacts of these decisions. What archaeology suggests is that local decision-making and community involvement is really key. We have a 1,000-year period from the protohistoric through the pre-Angkorian where there's a kind of stability in the river basin. We see that repeatedly, no matter how many sediment cores are laid down. It works well because everything has devolved to the local community level. It starts to fall apart when the state intervenes during the Angkorian period. It's during that time that you have where you have the manipulation of the rivers, where you start to have much of that kind of imbalance that occurs. So here, where you have local decision making, and this is only in Cambodia's delta. This is Prey Vang villagers talking about the white-winged duck, which they're going to conserve. And here in Siem Reap, which is the Angkor Tonle Sap region, where they're developing some community forest management practices. We have much more effective forms of governance. This is not new. Jim Scott wrote about it many years ago, but state-led initiatives often have catastrophic results. I'd also like to point out that another pattern that archaeology shows you is a kind of resilience in rural smallholder farming systems. We see that archaeologically for 1,500 years, and you see it even today. So here I just show you this traditional system of labor, which is called Provat Dai, and households work with each other to do everything from transplanting to harvesting. That happened until the Khmer Rouge. I hope it's coming back. And I wanted to end here, and I promise I'm ending soon now, by thinking in historical perspective. Let me quickly think in historical perspective. Right. So what we see here is that you have these transformations, and you can document them archaeologically, but you have some hinge points that are irreversible. And the hinge points that are irreversible oftentimes have to do with modifications of the rivers themselves. One hinge point, very quickly, that seemed irreversible was when the French introduced fishing lots in the 1930s for the Tonle Sap. And it ended up that there were something like 100 fishing lot concessionaires who were controlling all of Cambodia's waterways until 2012. And Hun Sen broke them up, not because he did it so that he could gain votes, but it could be a shift towards more community level governance because he also established different conservation regions and community-based fisheries. So what you see is efforts with dams, which are already having impact. I just wanted to show you this to bring us back to those monks in front of Angkor Wat. This is Stung Treng province. So this is where you have those rapids up there where the Mekong drops down before Kratia. And so we have evidence. My PhD student, Heng Pi Paul, is finishing up. He's dated these kinds of 6th century temples that were dedicated to spirits with inscriptions, the spirits of the river. We have nekta, these are Tom nekta, which are houses of spirits today, which villagers in Stung Treng appealed to actually in 2015 to try to stop the construction of the Mekong Dam. They weren't successful, but it's possible that if we have a more nuanced understanding and appreciation of the rivers, that we might be able to do things a little better. Cambodians have loved their rivers. People in the lower Mekong, the Lao and Thai, have loved their rivers for a very long time. These are boat races that happen when you have the reversal of the Tonle Sap, so the water starts coming back down into the Mekong Delta in November. It happens every year. We know it happened during the Angkorian period. They're also fighting, but they probably had boat races, and we have other images of that. And interestingly enough, you can actually go back 2,500 years to the Dong Son drums here, and you can see how important rivers were from northern Vietnam throughout the Mekong Basin. So there's a very long tradition of respecting your rivers and working with your rivers rather than working against it. And I'll take you one last place for a lesson. It's a lesson that maybe people who are historians wouldn't go, but we just have to go visit someone who's living in this gallery now. She should be going home, but she hasn't yet. And there she is. She's a Bapuan period deity, the second half of the 11th century, a time when Cambodians and Korean Khmers worship Vishnu and they worship Shiva. And we don't know who she's worshiping. But she was found up here at Angkor, where water was very important. And let's go up to these rivers, the sources of these rivers, which are sacred to the Cambodians. What we see there is Vishnu, carved into the water, with Lakshmi. You can't see her very well because part of her has been lopped off. But this is where the water starts. It goes all the way down into the Mekong Delta from Cambodia's point of view. It goes over lingam and sacralizes them. It goes through this river that's carved, that's called the River of 1,000 Lingam. And then it goes into the Tonle Sap. And that's the water, most of the water or a lot of the water that comes in. And from there, of course, it goes down and it meets the Mekong and goes into the Delta. So if there is a lesson to be learned, maybe it's that we need to respect our rivers a little bit better. Thank you.